Marriage, money, mothers, and much more. It's part 3 of my look at the Spartans on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil, and this is part 3 of a mini-series about Sparta, where I've been weighing up some common perceptions about the famous Greek city-state and asking to what extent these are true. In the last episode of the mini-series, I'll be focusing not on the military, but on the domestic and social elements of Spartan culture. You can find me on social media where I'm Ancient Blogger, on TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, and also the Ancient Blogger YouTube channel. And there's of course the Ancient History Hound subreddit as well. You can also go old school. My email address is ancientblogger@hotmail.com, so feel free to come and say hello. If you can review my podcast, please do, or if you know someone who might like it, then give them the nudge. Before I start, I need to provide a correction for part 2, where I spoke about the use of the word hoplite. You might recall me saying this was a new term for a soldier which seems to have come into existence in the 5th century BC. Exactly why isn't clear, but the use of it must have related to a development or new association. Now, the caveat I should have made related to the use of the word by Thucydides and Herodotus in events prior to the 5th century BC. You might again remember me saying both historians avoided using the word hoplite to describe soldiers in this period, that is to say, before the 5th century BC. However, there are in fact 3 occasions where the word hoplite is used by Thucydides and Herodotus and in the late 6th century BC. The argument I was using concluded that these instances were outliers and not part of a concerted effort by Thucydides and Herodotus to identify soldiers in this period as hoplites, and you might remember that's what I was saying in part 2. The main reason for this is that there are a number of military campaigns they cover which occurred before the 5th century BC and where they don't use that opportunity to employ the word hoplite. These 3 instances are therefore considered outliers and possible anachronisms. I know it's a bit niche, but I always want to ensure that I'm giving you the correct information, and to be honest with you, I'm kicking myself for not including that caveat. Okay then, let's get to it, and to the first topic, wealth. The word Spartan is commonly used today and sometimes to describe a life which is austere and lacking in luxury. In the context of wealth, this is predicated on the fact that Sparta didn't mint coinage during the classical period and apparently used iron bars as tradable items. Xenophon cited that this was something Lycurgus brought in. He forbade Spartans to pursue money-making and the pursuit of luxury items. The idea that Spartan citizens, that is to say the elite of the society, lived impoverished, drab lives is something to be challenged. In part 1 I tried to argue how the communal mess, the syssitia, which the adult male Spartans belonged to, weren't so much meagre barracks as lively hubs where men would dine relatively well and spend time pursuing hobbies such as hunting. That Spartans didn't mint coins can be interpreted as meaning that they were poor. However, Sparta was very wealthy in agriculture. Each Spartan had a lot of land allocated to him, which was worked by the helots, and this gave them an agricultural surplus. Indeed, to be a full Spartan citizen, it required you to have some of this surplus being used to pay your monthly membership dues for your communal mess or the syssitia. Measured this way, many Spartans were very well off. They were landowners with practically no overheads. That their wealth was linked to owning land did become a problem, and in the 4th century BC it seems land was increasingly being funneled to a few very wealthy families. Women who could inherit this came to own around 20% of it, which appalled the likes of Aristotle, who also criticised Spartan women for their love of luxury and excess. But even prior to this, Spartans were flashing their wealth at one of the major cultural events in ancient Greece, the Games at Olympia. The most prestigious event of this was the 4-horse chariot race, as it cost a great deal to train and own a team who you could enter. There were 8 games between 448 BC and 420 BC, Sparta won 7 of them in this event, and that was shared between 6 different Spartans. Moving from the fiscally famous to the infamous, Herodotus wrote several accounts of high-level Spartans, including kings, being bribed. Some bribes were refused, though instances don't always seem to imply that it was due to the bribe itself, more what was being asked for the bribe. My favourite involved King Leotygidas, who ruled alongside the more famous King Leonidas. Where his co-king fell in glory, Leotygidas was caught red-handed, or sort of. Whilst on campaign in Thessaly, he withdrew his forces and was accused of being bribed to do so. These allegations were made a bit more substantive when he was found in camp sitting on a glove full of money. He was eventually exiled as a result. The link between the military and money had a practical context. In 424 BC, the Peloponnesian War was in full swing, and the Spartan general Bershadsky headed north with an army. To increase the size of it, he recruited mercenaries in the southern Peloponnese, and these, as Thucydides noted, were sourced using coinage. Sparta, by this point, and even more towards the end of the 5th century BC, was facing a reality. Coin was king, or at least coin could make kings. Persia was a source to tap on occasion, where its vast wealth could support navies and the like. In this world, the laws of Lycurgus about coinage and wealth were becoming, pun intended, increasingly archaic. It's debated as to how Sparta engaged with the practical nature of coinage and the increased wealth coming into the city-state following its success in the Peloponnesian War. Xenophon was able to comment on what he saw around this time. When considering how the old laws of Lycurgus were holding, he gave a literary shrug and made this comment, and I quote, "I am also aware of how in the past they feared any disclosure that they had gold in their possession, though nowadays there are even some who glory in having acquired it." End quote. It wasn't just a pro-Spartan source such as Xenophon. In Plato's dialogue Alcibiades, it's claimed that there's more gold in private hands in Sparta than everywhere else in Greece. The challenge to all of this is the overarching caveat whenever discussing Sparta, the lack of Spartan source material, that is to say, Spartans writing about Spartans. But I sense from what I've summarised, you can make a case that the image of Sparta as a Dorian, Dickensian workhouse wasn't really the case. The motif of lacking offers a segue into our next area of discussion, literacy and education. In part 1, I spoke about the agoge, the Spartan state education system. It's often positioned as only developing the characteristics to make a good soldier. But again, we can argue there was a bit more to it than that. The historian Thucydides provided a good example of the Spartan stereotype in his account of a Spartan giving a speech, and I quote, "We are wise because we are not so highly educated as to look down upon our laws and customs, and are too rigorously trained in self-control to be able to disobey them." End quote. This encapsulates much of what we might expect about the Spartans and what they were taught. Albeit there are later sources from the 4th century BC, Plato and Isocrates provided a different account. In Plato's Laws, the character of Megillus commented on how the Spartans were big fans of Homer and what also were deemed foreign poets. Isocrates, in his work The Panathenaicus, is chided by a student who pointed out that the Spartans weren't as backward as Isocrates thought, adding that many of them were fans of his speeches and actually had copies. That overarching caveat I mentioned earlier about not having Spartans writing about Spartans looms into view once again. However, we can argue that literacy was a thing at Sparta through other means. Sources, for example Thucydides, reference Spartan treaties, which must have been written. He even included an instance in which the Spartan ephors were shown an incriminating letter to be used as evidence. This is notable because ephors were elected from citizen Spartans, and as such, it's plausible to conclude that literacy was something taught, presumably at the agoge. A final piece of evidence we can add here is that there are references to inscriptions in and around Sparta made by the sources. For example, the stelae with the names of those who fell at Thermopylae. I think it can be argued that literacy was in place at Sparta, and on a practical level, it would be difficult to see how it could function without it. As mentioned, how do you form treaties without it? How do you conduct internal affairs without the ability to read and write? The idea that Sparta was a place where people couldn't read and write wasn't just a generalized insult, though. It could be understood as a criticism of the political system there. To explain this, we need to consider Sparta's great opponent, Athens, and specifically that it was a democracy. Debates in democracy require the ability to think, to form opinions and the like. Literacy facilitates this quality. Sparta was set as the opposite of Athens, particularly in its political structure. If you're Athenian, you could easily set Sparta up as the antithesis in other ways, in this case, a political system which doesn't require its participants to input. Instead, they're told what to do and what to think. You might therefore conclude that Spartans weren't bothered with literacy because it wasn't needed. But it's likely, as I've said, that this wasn't the case. Literacy would have been needed, and we know that arts such as choral dancing and singing were popular in Sparta. A final point about the Spartans was that the literacy would have extended to girls and women as part of their education. And on the subject of Spartan women, let's talk marriage. When it came to the affairs of the heart and home, there are some eyebrow-raising accounts about Spartans and their marriage customs. Perhaps the most well-known of these is mentioned in Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, and involved the marriage ceremony on the wedding night. And I quote, "The so-called bridesmaid took charge of the captured girl. She first shaved her head to the scalp, then dressed her in a man's cloak and sandals, and laid her down on a mattress in the dark." End quote. In case you're wondering where the groom was in all of this, well, he was in his Syssitia, the mess, which I've covered in previous episodes. He would, however, slip away and meet up with his bride in secret before returning the same night. There's a lot to say about this, but the most important thing is that this account only features in Plutarch. It's not mentioned by any earlier or contemporary sources. Though this isn't a reason to dismiss it, the absence of this ceremony referenced anywhere else does make it less tenable. In part 1 I spoke about Plutarch and the challenges of using him as a source. I won't go over this again, but if you want to understand why, then you have yet another reason to listen to that episode. Getting back to the curiosity of the wedding night, a good contender as a place where this might be mentioned is Aristophanes, the Athenian comic playwright. His play Lysistrata featured a Spartan woman called Lampito, and throughout the play she is used as a setup for things the Athenians found odd about Spartan women and Spartan culture. For example, within the first few lines of her entry into the play, there are references to her being strong enough to strangle a bull and the bibasis, a type of dance which Spartan women famously performed. It is of course plausible that Aristophanes was aware of what Plutarch gave an account of, and didn't think that it was worth including, but I find that more or less impossible to believe, given the amount of laughs which he could have mined from it. Attempts have been made to try and understand the ritual. I sometimes hear that it was all to do with getting the groom more accustomed to his bride, because Spartan men were somehow not that used to women, and dressing her in this way helped him. Let's just leave it at that. Well, firstly, Spartan men would have been well acquainted with Spartan women. At a young age, they would have exercised together, and Spartan women, as well known, weren't exactly hidden away. Secondly, what's the point of a disguise if it's worn in the dark? Thirdly, really, how could this heighten the mood? How would it have worked exactly? Don't give me answers on a postcard, but just think about it. Sometimes I even read that a beard was worn by the bride, but this was a separate thing entirely. Separate because it was a thing which had occurred at Argos, not Sparta. Apparently, the women of Argos were being punished for thinking that they were above marrying men from the lower classes. As such, the punishment was for them to be made to wear beards. Given that we only have the account from Plutarch and Pausanias, much later sources, it's debated as the whole beard thing ever really happened at all. Going back to Sparta, what has given the account of the wedding night ritual credibility is that there are elements within it which are found elsewhere and recognisable. For example, cutting of hair was a rite of passage. Likewise, the wearing of a particular garment. The word cloak is used, but more likely this was a hemation, which I mentioned in part 1, a sort of Greek toga which Spartan youths wore. The fact that this was all done in secret is also a familiar element in Spartan society. It was Xenophon who wrote how newlyweds were required to meet in secret, and it was shameful for the husband to be seen making a visit to his wife. The rationale given here was that by making the visits less frequent, the time husband and wife spent together would be, let's call it, more passionate, which would therefore lead to healthier and more vigorous Spartan babies. I should also note there's an interesting argument as to the element of shame here. There's no clear reference as to whom the husband should be ashamed of being seen by. It could be, for example, the shame of the husband being seen in and around the bedchamber by non-Spartans, for example, Helots. When it comes to Plutarch's account of the wedding night ceremony, we meet a number of dynamics which I mentioned in part 1 in relation to how we handle Plutarch as a source. Was he exaggerating sources he was using, or were the sources themselves a bit, shall we say, speculative? As Plutarch was writing centuries after the classical period, there's also the problem of him referring to Spartan customs which were in place later on, that is to say, not during the classical period. And yes, there is also the chance that he was inventing stuff, but I like to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he was using sources which themselves weren't entirely accurate. Another bizarre marriage ceremony was mentioned in Athenaeus' work, the Deipnosophistae, which dates to around AD 200. Here, a certain Hermippus of Smyrna is cited. He dates earlier to the 3rd century BC and commented about literal blind dates, and I quote, "At Lacedaemon all the damsels used to be shut up in a dark room, while a number of unmarried young men were shut up with them, and whichever girl each of the young men caught hold of, he led away as his wife, without a dowry." End quote. The element of darkness and secrecy again surfaces. However, there are reasons to critique this. To begin with, marriage was an important political and social tool in Sparta, not something left to chance. There's also the possibility of this as a misread of some symbolic capture element within the ceremony. Think of how you could present the father of the bride giving his daughter away in a modern marriage ceremony as something very different. There's also the chance that this related to a practice which occurred after the classical period, given that Hermippus was writing about it. Finally, one point of note is the fact that this references women without a dowry, so it's possible this was used in particular circumstances for women of a lower social status or something similar to that. There was one practice we can be more confident about which happened between husband and wife and, well, insert other, pun intended, polyandry. Xenophon, a contemporary source as you might well know, wrote about polyandry at Sparta. This took two main forms. The first, that if a husband had a younger wife, he could arrange for a younger man to father children with her. The second, that a man could request to have children with another man's wife. The rationale behind this is one we've already met, the need for children born to Spartan parents. It also presents the overarching importance of the Spartan state. Families and your lineage were important, but what the Spartan state needed always came first. And this is another example of how diametrically opposed Spartan culture was with other Greek city-states. The idea of another man having children with a wife of a married citizen was outrageous in pretty much everywhere else. Having healthy children was a reason for another difference in Sparta, the age at which women were married. At Athens, marriage may have taken place for a woman, or a girl to be more exact, between the ages of 12 and 15. However, at Sparta, the age of 18 onwards has been given as when this took place from. The reason for this, as provided by Xenophon, was again the drive for healthy babies. As you will have detected, the production of healthy Spartan babies was a real social driver, and partially the reason why Spartan girls and women were encouraged to exercise. Xenophon gave us the rationale behind this, and I quote, "Other Greeks require women to be sedentary, like the majority of craftsmen, sitting still and working wool. But then how should girls brought up like this be expected to bear any strapping babies?" End quote. Public exercise for women of all ages at Sparta seems to have been a social cornerstone. That it improved the health of mothers-to-be was one reason for it. We could even speculate that this was a later rationale which sought to justify why it was in place at Sparta, as there may have been other reasons originally. The subject of children brings me another tale often told about Sparta, and quite a dark one. In Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, we have the infamous account of what happens to a newborn. The baby is taken to the elders of the village or tribe and checked for any issues. If it was considered deficient in any way, it was exposed at a chasm called the Apothetae at the foot of Mount Taygetus. Now, it is important to note here that infanticide was practiced at Sparta as it was across ancient Greece. Generally speaking, it was the father who would decide the fate of the infant, not the elders, and this is a distinction Plutarch points out in his account. At Sparta, it wasn't up to the father whether the child survived or not. The Spartan practice and their version of infanticide is sometimes extolled as to how rigorous and extreme the Spartans could be. However, the evidence for this is tenuous at best. To begin with, the Apothetae has been excavated. 46 bodies were found and identified. They date to the 6th and 5th centuries BC, but were all over the age of 18. No infants have been found there. We meet a familiar problem here, namely Plutarch as being the only person who gives this story. At face value, it just can't be substantiated, despite its appearance on social media as a given. It would be easy to accuse Plutarch of making this up, but as I have a soft spot for him, I'll indulge in making something of a case for him. I'll start with the given about Sparta, that the state was the big important thing. It made the decisions. It's plausible that a newborn Spartan citizen was given some form of state recognition by the elders in the village or community as part of a rite of passage. What might follow would be something which occurred throughout Greece, a decision as to whether the infant was to be kept or not. It's plausible then that the two separate elements were combined and done so to underline how the Spartan state provided oversight on its citizens, how much more it was important than the family, or rather the head of the family. If you were looking to criticize the nature of the Spartan state, this would be a nice way to go about it. I then come to the Apothetae. If this was a place where criminals and traitors were dispatched by the state, then it follows this would be the place for an unfortunate Spartan babe to meet their end. This is all, of course, speculative, but you can see how sources may have created an event which we have no real substantial evidence for through existing cultural practices. I didn't want to leave on such a sad topic, so I thought I could end on some fun involving the sayings of Spartan women, which was collated by Plutarch. I gave a brief overview of these in part 1. In short, they're more a mix of entertaining quips than historical facts. Much like the other sayings Plutarch collected, they present a concentrated moral position which was used by a variety of people for a variety of purposes. Dating them is very tricky, and the likelihood is that most were created after the classical period by non-Spartans who wanted to represent a Spartan ideal via a catchy anecdote. It's also difficult to know how they were received. Were they considered true or a bit of a joke at the time of Plutarch, something akin to the Chuck Norris joke craze from a few years ago? However, they are fun and also disturbing, particularly those attributed to Spartan mothers. A common theme is presenting the mother as a regulator of the sort of social codes and morals, particularly those involving bravery and self-sacrifice. When one mother was confronted with her two sons who had fled the battle, she lifted her tunic and asked them both to crawl back in. Yep, I did warn you. Mothers verbally abusing their sons for dishonouring themselves appear a few times on the list, and you might think, well, sticks and stones and all of that. But Spartan mothers were more than happy to accommodate the potential of sticks and stones in this context. One son returned home, and as he approached he told his mother that the rest of his colleagues had been killed. His mum picked up a tile and killed him with it, while saying, "Then why did they send you to bring us the bad news?" Mothers killing their sons is obviously extreme, and an additional taboo which the sidestep would be the resulting pollution and invariable punishment by the gods for doing such a thing. I'll finish with one less severe famous saying that you have likely heard. It's attributed to Gorgo, the Spartan queen and wife of Leonidas. A woman from Attica, the region Athens controlled, was said to have asked her why Spartan women ruled over men. She replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." A laconic burn, if ever there was one. And on that, I've come to the end of the episode and the 3-part mini-series. I really hope you've enjoyed and learnt a few things. Let me know what you think as ever. And until next time, keep safe and stay well.